Well, we have to ship the gold back from London to Singapore, and everything was very nicely balanced, on the Singapore Airlines. When the passengers left the plane tilted under the weight of the gold.
If you had to put the odds on the dollar still being the dominant reserve currency of choice in 20 years, what would the odds be?
I would guess that the dollar's role as a reserve currency would be probably in the vicinity of 40%.
And from time to time, we will get into crises. And during times of crisis, gold is the ultimate hedge. So in our case in Singapore, we've always held gold as part of our reserves. I had the onerous task of bringing back physical gold from gold vaults in London to bring it back to store part of it in Singapore. That was the context.
Tell them about the plane.
Well, we have to ship the gold back from London to Singapore, and everything was very nicely balanced, on the Singapore Airlines aircraft. And flew into Singapore, everything was fine at Heathrow. We made a landing I think in Dubai. But upon arriving in Singapore, we thought that the good thing to do was to ask the passengers to disembark from the plane first. But lo and behold, when the passengers left the plane tilted under the weight of the gold. So we had to get the passengers to get back to the plane to rebalance so that the gold can be loaded in a gentle way without tilting.
The United States is spending, this year will spend $7 trillion, and it will take in $5 trillion. It cannot cut back on its spending for various reasons. So it's overspending by 40%. Because it is overspent for so long, it has a debt that is 6 times the amount of money that it is taking in. In these cycles, you see the process of debt service payments squeezing out spending. So in other words, as debt rises relative to incomes, you have to pay more debt service payments in the form of interest and principal payments. So what we have now is we're going to have to borrow $2 trillion for the deficit. We have an interest payment of $1 trillion, so half the budget deficits. And we have to roll over maturing debt of $9 trillion. That means you have to sell $12 trillion in debt. And the market in the world does not have that same sort of demand for that debt. And that creates a supply-demand imbalance, which is a problem.
How did things get so bad in the US? I mean, you're highly connected in economic and political circles in the US, years of doing business there. How did the situation get so bad?
Human nature. Human nature, self-discipline. We talk about Singapore and the history of Singapore. And it was, just said earlier, it's basic. The self-discipline to save, thrift, it was mentioned. And that self-discipline, look at the opposite. I think it's now that the earnings from the saving pay for about 20% of the budget here. So self-discipline, often a political system. There's a challenge from the political system to have self-discipline because people want. I went to Washington and I spoke to leaders of both sides and explained all of this and we discussed.
Are they listening?
And everybody agrees. And then I say, I have a path. If you can get the deficit down to 3% of GDP from where it'll be about 7, which would require about a 4% increase in taxes, a 4% decrease in spending, and an interest rate decline that would naturally come from that, then you would stabilize the situation, at least not add to it. And so I said, I think you need to, if you get everybody to take the 3% pledge, we'll get it down to that. And so the answer that I got is that that's not possible.
This big, beautiful bill is now giving way to a big, beautiful problem. Ray talked about appetite for U.S. debt. We all know that record deficits, appetite for U.S. debt, China, Japan, two of the big foreign holders of U.S. debt, something like $2 trillion. What happens if this U.S. debt continues to spiral? Gok Song, what do you predict is going to happen?
Well, it's interesting that, okay, the U.S. will not default on the debt. It's American debt, it's U.S. dollar debt. Countries don't default, not like you and me. Personally, we can go bankrupt. The U.S. is not going to default on its debt. So if you have $100 worth of U.S. Treasury bonds, you're still going to get back $100. The question is, what is that $100 worth in terms of gold?
If you had to put the odds on the dollar still being the dominant reserve currency of choice in 20 years, what would the odds be? 90%? 50%? Or below that?
Well, when you say reserve currency, I think, again, the dollar through the 70s retained its stature as a reserve currency. So we're dealing with the transactional basis. I would guess that the dollar's role as a reserve currency would be probably in the vicinity of 40%. That it would decline to about 40% as a medium of exchange. But I do think, as we're talking about, as a storehold of wealth and its value, which is reflected in the the real purchasing power of holding it, and you hold it in a debt instrument, I think that would decline very significantly.
A big round of applause, please.